You step outside for a moment. Maybe it's morning, maybe late afternoon. The air is quiet, and somewhere nearby there is a tree. Not a special tree, just an ordinary one. Maybe it's standing beside a road, or growing quietly in a park, or in the corner of a yard where people pass it every day without thinking. You walk over to it and place your hand on the bark. That's all. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no flash of light, no sudden rush of energy, no hidden voice whispering secrets about the universe. From the outside, it looks like absolutely nothing important occurred. A person touched a tree. The moment passes in a few seconds, and life continues. But if you slow the moment down and look at it carefully through the lens of science, something surprisingly complex is happening. In fact, far more is happening than our everyday language can describe. The first misunderstanding begins with the way we talk about nature. People often say things like, "Go outside and connect with nature." It sounds reasonable, it sounds poetic, but from the perspective of physics, that sentence is already a little bit wrong. It suggests that humans exist separately from nature, as if we live outside of it and occasionally visit it. But the universe does not divide itself that way. There is no physical boundary where nature ends and humans begin. The atoms inside your body do not carry labels saying, "human atoms," and the atoms inside a tree do not belong to some separate category called nature atoms. They are made of the exact same ingredients. Your hand contains carbon atoms. The tree's bark contains carbon atoms. Your body contains oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. The tree is built from those same elements. If you trace those atoms backward through time, something even stranger appears. The carbon inside your skin did not originate on Earth. Billions of years ago, it was created inside the core of a star. When that star eventually died in a violent explosion, the atoms were scattered across space. Over immense stretches of time, some of those atoms became part of our planet. Some became rocks. Some became oceans. Some became living cells. Eventually, those atoms passed through countless forms of life before becoming part of a human body or a tree trunk. So when you place your hand against a tree, you are not bringing two separate worlds together. You are watching two temporary arrangements of the same cosmic material briefly interact. The tree is one pattern of matter. You are another pattern of matter. Both patterns follow the same laws of physics. Both are built from atoms that share a common history stretching back billions of years. Yet our brains naturally perceive a sharp difference between us and everything else. That separation is useful for survival. It helps us navigate the world quickly. But scientifically speaking, the boundary is more of a mental shortcut than a physical reality. The universe does not recognize it. From the perspective of physics, what you call you and what you call the tree are simply two incredibly complex arrangements of particles interacting through fundamental forces. When your hand touches the bark, those particles begin influencing each other instantly. Electromagnetic forces push back against the pressure of your skin. Tiny electrical signals start moving through your nerves. Your brain begins interpreting patterns of texture and temperature. All of that begins the moment your hand arrives. But most of it happens so quickly and at such small scales that your conscious mind never notices. To you, it just feels like touching a tree. To physics, it is an intricate exchange of forces, signals, and molecules between two living systems that share the same ancient origin in the universe. And that is only the beginning of the story. Now let's zoom in much closer to the moment your hand rests on the bark. At first glance, it seems obvious what is happening. Your skin touches the tree, the two surfaces meet. Simple. But physics tells a much stranger story. If we could shrink ourselves down to the size of atoms and observe what is really happening at that boundary between your hand and the tree, we would discover something surprising. Nothing actually touches. This sounds impossible because your senses clearly tell you that contact occurred. You feel the rough bark pressing against your skin. The sensation seems direct and obvious. Yet at the atomic level, contact is not what it appears to be. Everything around you, including your hand in the tree, is made of atoms. Each atom consists of a tiny nucleus surrounded by a cloud of electrons. These electrons carry negative electric charge. And one of the fundamental rules of electromagnetism is that like charges repel each other. Negative charges push away other negative charges. When your hand approaches the tree bark, the electrons in your skin begin interacting with the electrons in the atoms of the tree. As the two surfaces move closer, those electrons start to strongly repel each other. This repulsion becomes stronger and stronger as the distance shrinks. Eventually, the force pushing the atoms apart becomes powerful enough to stop them from getting any closer. At that point, the surfaces cannot move further into each other. Your brain interprets that electromagnetic resistance as pressure. That feeling is what you call touch. So the strange truth is this: the sensation of touching something is actually the result of countless microscopic force fields pushing against one another. Your skin never truly merges with the tree. The atoms remain separated by incredibly tiny distances, held apart by the electromagnetic force. The same thing happens every time you sit in a chair, lean against a wall, or pick up a cup. What feels like solid contact is really a balance of invisible forces between atoms. Now something even more fascinating begins. Your skin is not just a passive surface. It is packed with specialized sensors designed to detect physical changes in the environment. These receptors are small biological structures embedded in the layers of your skin, and each type responds to different kinds of stimulation. Some receptors respond to pressure. Some respond to vibration. Others detect temperature or stretching of the skin. When your hand presses against the rough bark of the tree, those receptors begin to activate almost instantly. Tiny mechanical deformations in your skin open microscopic channels in nerve cells. Charged particles begin flowing across cell membranes, generating electrical signals. These signals travel along nerve fibers that run from your hand up through your arm and into your spinal cord. From there, the signals move to the brain, and they move fast. Some nerve impulses travel close to 100 meters per second. Within a fraction of a second after touching the tree, your brain begins receiving streams of information about the surface beneath your hand. But the brain does something remarkable with those signals. It does not simply record them like a camera recording an image. Instead, the brain constructs an interpretation. It analyzes patterns in the incoming signals and creates a model of what it believes the object feels like. Your brain decides that the surface is rough. It decides that the temperature is slightly cool. It recognizes irregular patterns in the bark. All of that happens without conscious effort. You don't have to think about it. Your nervous system performs the calculations automatically. In a sense, your brain is constantly running a simulation of the physical world based on signals from your senses. When you touch the tree, that simulation updates. New sensory information slightly modifies the neural connections responsible for representing texture and touch. Scientists call this process neuroplasticity. The brain is not a fixed machine, it is a dynamic system that changes with experience. Even a simple interaction like touching bark can produce tiny adjustments in neural pathways. That means the act of touching a tree is not just something you experience. It is something that subtly changes the physical structure of your brain. Your nervous system becomes, in a very small but measurable way, different from what it was a moment earlier. And all of this begins from a simple action that seemed, at first, completely ordinary, placing your hand on a tree. Now something even more interesting begins to happen, and it happens inside your brain. The moment your hand presses against the bark, the receptors in your skin send electrical signals racing through your nervous system. These signals travel through nerves in your arm, into your spinal cord, and then upward toward the brain. This entire process is incredibly fast. Some nerve signals move close to 100 meters per second. That means the information from your hand reaches your brain in just a fraction of a second. But what happens next is not as simple as people often imagine. Most people think the brain works like a camera. Something happens in the outside world, the brain records it, and that becomes your experience. But the brain doesn't actually work that way. Instead, the brain constantly builds a model of reality using signals from your senses. It gathers small pieces of information, pressure, temperature, texture, and combines them into a larger interpretation. When your hand touches the bark, your brain begins analyzing the incoming signals. Certain nerve endings detect pressure. They respond when your skin slightly compresses against the tree. Other receptors detect vibration. Even the smallest irregularities in the bark can cause tiny vibrations in the skin that your nervous system notices. Then there are receptors that detect temperature. Tree bark is often cooler than human skin because it exchanges heat with the surrounding air and ground differently than your body does. Your brain receives all of these signals at once. But instead of showing you raw data, it converts those signals into something meaningful. It produces the sensation you recognize as roughness. That rough feeling is not actually in the tree itself. It exists inside the interpretation your brain creates. The tree simply provides a complex physical surface. Your nervous system translates that surface into a sensory experience. And here is where something subtle but fascinating happens. Each time your brain processes a new tactile pattern, it slightly adjusts its internal wiring. This process is called neuroplasticity. It means that the brain is constantly changing its structure in response to experience. Neurons form connections with other neurons through structures called synapses. When certain pathways are used repeatedly, those connections can strengthen. When pathways are rarely used, they can weaken over time. Touching different textures provides new patterns of sensory input. The brain refines its ability to interpret those patterns by adjusting the strength of neural connections. Imagine the brain like a huge network of roads. Some roads become larger highways because traffic flows through them frequently. Others become smaller because they are rarely used. Every sensory experience sends traffic through certain pathways. When you touch the bark of a tree, signals travel through specific regions of the brain responsible for touch perception. These regions are part of the somatosensory cortex, an area that maps sensations from different parts of the body. In that map, your hand occupies a surprisingly large space. Human hands contain thousands of sensory receptors, so the brain dedicates a significant amount of processing power to interpreting signals from them. When your fingers explore the rough surface of the bark, the neurons responsible for those signals become active. With repeated experience, the brain becomes better at recognizing similar textures in the future. In other words, your brain learns from touch. Even a simple moment, like resting your hand against a tree, can contribute to that learning process. But there is another layer to this story. Your brain does not simply receive information from the outside world. It also predicts what it expects to feel. Before your hand even reaches the tree, your brain already has an idea of what bark should feel like. That prediction comes from previous experiences with similar surfaces. When the real sensory signals arrive, the brain compares them to its expectations. If the signals match the prediction, everything feels normal. If they differ, the brain updates its model of reality. This constant process of prediction and correction allows humans to understand the physical world with incredible efficiency. The simple act of touching a tree becomes part of a continuous learning system, one that shapes how your brain interprets the environment. And while the change from a single touch may be tiny, the principle is important. Your brain is not a fixed observer of the world. It is a dynamic system, constantly reshaping itself through interaction with the environment around it. So when you place your hand against the bark of a tree, something subtle but real occurs. The tree does not change very much, but your brain does. Now there is another layer of the story that most people never think about, and it has nothing to do with nerves or the brain. It has to do with chemistry in the air around you. Trees are not silent, inactive objects standing in the environment. They are constantly producing and releasing chemical molecules. These molecules drift into the air, spread through forests, and move with the wind. Many of these chemicals are called phytoncides. Phytoncides are small organic molecules that plants produce as part of their survival strategy. Plants cannot run away from insects, bacteria, or fungi that try to attack them. Instead, they rely heavily on chemistry to defend themselves. When a tree is stressed, damaged, or simply growing, it releases compounds that can affect the organisms around it. Some of these molecules discourage insects from feeding on leaves. Others help protect the plant from harmful microbes. In forests, trees even use chemical signals to communicate with neighboring plants, warning them about certain threats. But humans also breathe these molecules. Every time you walk near trees, tiny amounts of these airborne chemicals enter your lungs. They dissolve into the moisture inside your respiratory system and interact with cells in your body. Your body does not interpret these chemicals as a message from a tree. It simply treats them as molecules interacting with biological receptors. Yet those interactions can still have measurable effects. Researchers studying forest environments have observed that exposure to phytoncides can influence certain physiological processes in humans. Some studies suggest that breathing air rich in these plant compounds may slightly reduce levels of cortisol, a hormone associated with stress responses in the body. Other experiments have shown changes in immune activity after people spend time in forest environments. In particular, some immune cells appear to become more active after prolonged exposure to natural plant chemicals. The exact mechanisms behind these effects are still being investigated. The human body contains an enormous network of chemical signaling pathways, and many molecules can interact with those pathways in complex ways. It is important to remain cautious here. Scientists are still studying these processes, and many details are not fully understood. The biological systems involved are extremely complicated. However, what we do know is simple trees release chemicals into the air, and humans inevitably inhale some of those chemicals when they are nearby. Your body responds because every molecule that enters your system participates in chemical reactions. Biology is at its core chemistry organized into living structures. Now consider what happens when you place your hand on a tree and stand beside it for a moment. You are not only experiencing the mechanical sensation of the bark, you are also breathing the air around the tree, an air that may contain tiny amounts of plant-produced molecules. These molecules are invisible. You cannot feel them directly. Your senses provide no obvious signal that they are there. Yet your body may still detect them at the molecular level. Cells throughout your body contain receptors that bind to specific chemical structures. When certain molecules attach to these receptors, they can trigger changes inside the cell. Sometimes those changes affect metabolism. Sometimes they influence hormone signaling or immune responses. This process is happening constantly. Every breath you take brings new molecules into your body, and your cells continuously respond to them. In a forest environment, the mixture of airborne chemicals is very different from what you encounter in dense urban settings filled with synthetic materials, exhaust gases, and industrial pollutants. Natural environments contain complex mixtures of plant-derived compounds that humans have been exposed to throughout evolutionary history. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in landscapes where these molecules were part of the air they breathed every day. From an evolutionary perspective, the human body developed in constant interaction with plant chemistry. So when you stand beside a tree, touching its bark and breathing quietly for a moment, something subtle is happening. Your body is interacting not only with the physical surface of the tree, but also with the invisible chemical environment it produces. None of this feels dramatic. Your brain does not announce that molecules have entered your lungs. There is no sudden awareness of chemical exchange. But at the microscopic level, interactions between plant molecules and human biology are taking place. It is a quiet exchange between two living systems sharing the same atmosphere. The tree releases molecules as part of its own survival. You breathe them simply because you exist in the same environment. And without either organism intending it, a small chemical conversation begins. There is another subtle piece of physics happening when you place your hand on a tree, and it has to do with electricity. Not the dramatic kind that produces lightning or sparks, but the quiet electrical behavior that exists around us all the time. Every object around you carries electric charge. Usually the amount is extremely small, so small that you never notice it. But from the perspective of physics, the electrical state of your body is constantly changing as you move through the environment. When you walk across a floor, especially a dry surface or synthetic carpet, friction can cause electrons to transfer between materials. This process is known as the triboelectric effect. It is the same process responsible for the small static shock you sometimes feel when touching a metal doorknob after walking across a carpet. In that moment, your body may carry a slightly different electrical charge compared to the object you touch. The universe always tends to move toward balance. When two objects with different electrical potentials come into contact, Electrons may shift between them in order to equalize that difference. Most of the time, the movement of charge is so tiny that it goes completely unnoticed. But the physics is still real. Your body is not electrically isolated. It is part of the larger electrical environment surrounding it. Even the air contains charged particles. The ground beneath your feet holds enormous reservoirs of electrical charge distributed across the Earth's surface. Now consider the tree. A tree is not just a wooden structure standing upright. Inside it is a complex network of water-filled tissues that transport nutrients and minerals from the soil to the leaves. These tissues contain dissolved ions, atoms that carry electric charge because they have gained or lost electrons. Water mixed with ions can conduct electricity. Because the roots of the tree extend deep into the soil, the tree is usually electrically connected to the earth. In a sense, it is part of the planet's electrical system. The ground itself acts as a massive reservoir capable of absorbing or supplying tiny electrical charges. So when you touch a tree, something simple but interesting can occur. Your body and the tree momentarily become part of the same conductive pathway. If there is any small imbalance of electrical charge between your body and the tree, electrons may shift slightly until the difference is reduced. The amount of charge involved is typically extremely small, far below the level that your nervous system could detect. There is no spark, no visible sign of anything happening, yet from a physical standpoint, your body and the tree briefly participate in the same electrical system. You could imagine it like connecting two containers of water with a small tube. If one container has slightly more water than the other, some water flows through the tube until the levels become closer to equal. In the case of electricity, the water is the movement of electrons. The same principle operates constantly in the natural world. Electrical charges move through the atmosphere, through soil, through water, and through living organisms. Lightning is simply a dramatic example of a much larger electrical system that constantly exists between the earth and the sky. Compared to lightning, the electrical exchange between a human hand and a tree is incredibly small. But it is still governed by the same physical laws. Your body contains electrically active cells. Every nerve signal in your nervous system relies on the movement of charged particles across cell membranes. Your brain itself functions through carefully controlled electrical activity between billions of neurons. Electricity is not something separate from biology. It is deeply embedded in how living systems operate. So when your hand rests against the bark of a tree, there is a quiet electrical connection forming between two conductive systems. One system is the human body, filled with fluids carrying dissolved ions and producing electrical signals in nerves and muscles. The other system is a living tree, filled with water, nutrients, and charged particles moving slowly through its internal structures. For a brief moment, those two systems share a physical link. Electrons may shift slightly. Electrical potentials may adjust. Nothing dramatic happens. The changes are microscopic and fleeting. But the interaction reminds us of something fundamental. Living organisms are not isolated objects sitting on top of the earth. They are embedded within the planet's physical systems, chemical, mechanical, and electrical. And sometimes, through something as simple as placing a hand on a tree, those systems briefly overlap. There is another question worth asking. Why does touching something like tree bark often feel different from touching plastic, glass, or metal? Not in a mystical sense, but in a neurological sense. Many people notice that natural textures feel strangely familiar or comfortable. Rough wood, soil, stone, leaves. These surfaces often produce a sensory experience that feels normal, almost expected. Artificial surfaces can feel different. Smooth plastic or polished metal sometimes feels oddly sterile, even if we cannot explain exactly why. To understand this, we need to think about evolution. The human nervous system did not appear suddenly in the modern world. It developed slowly over hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by the environments our ancestors lived in. For the vast majority of human history, people lived outdoors in landscapes filled with plants, rocks, water, soil, and animals. Natural materials surrounded every moment of life. Hands touched tree bark while climbing. Feet walked across soil and grass. Fingers handled wood, stone tools, animal fur, and flowing water. These textures were not occasional experiences. They were constant parts of the sensory world that shaped the evolution of our nervous system. The human brain is the product of those conditions. When scientists study sensory systems, they often find that the brain is especially good at processing the kinds of patterns that existed in the environments where the species evolved. Our visual system, for example, is particularly skilled at detecting natural shapes and movements. Our hearing system is highly sensitive to the frequencies found in human voices and environmental sounds. The same idea applies to touch. Natural surfaces tend to contain irregular, complex patterns. Tree bark is not perfectly smooth. It has cracks, ridges, and tiny variations in structure. If you run your fingers across it, your skin encounters a constantly changing pattern of pressure and vibration. These patterns contain what scientists sometimes call natural noise. They are not random, but they are also not perfectly uniform. Artificial materials, on the other hand, often contain extremely regular surfaces. Plastic and glass can be manufactured to be almost perfectly smooth at scales that rarely occur in nature. When your fingers move across those surfaces, the sensory signals reaching your brain can be unusually uniform. In some cases, the receptors in your skin receive less varied information than they would when exploring natural materials. Your nervous system is fully capable of interpreting both types of surfaces, of course. Humans adapt to almost any environment. But there is an interesting possibility that researchers continue to explore the idea that the human sensory system may be especially tuned to the complexity of natural textures, because those textures dominated the environments in which our ancestors evolved. Think of it like a language. If you grow up hearing a particular language, your brain becomes extremely efficient at recognizing its sounds and patterns. Another language might still be understandable, but it may require more effort because the patterns are less familiar. Touch may work in a somewhat similar way. Natural environments provide sensory patterns that the human nervous system has processed for an extremely long time in evolutionary history. Our brains may simply recognize those patterns more easily. When your fingers move across the bark of a tree, the receptors in your skin send streams of varied information to your brain. Small ridges create tiny vibrations. Cracks and grooves produce shifting pressure signals. Your brain interprets all of this automatically. What you experience is the simple sensation of touching bark. But behind that sensation is an intricate exchange of information between the physical structure of the tree and the sensory systems inside your body. And because those systems evolved in environments full of similar textures, the experience may feel oddly natural. Not magical, not mysterious. Just familiar to a nervous system shaped by countless generations interacting with the physical complexity of the natural world. So when your hand rests against a tree, something interesting is happening at the level of evolution. Your nervous system is encountering a surface that resembles the kinds of textures it has been interpreting for an extraordinarily long time. In a sense, your brain is speaking a sensory language that the natural world has been writing for millions of years. Now imagine a small thought experiment. Suppose a human being grows up in an environment that is completely artificial. From birth, this person lives inside a perfectly controlled structure. The walls are smooth. The floors are smooth. The furniture is smooth. Every surface is carefully manufactured so that it feels uniform to the touch. There are no trees, no soil, no rough stones, no leaves, and no natural textures anywhere in this environment. The air is filtered. The temperature is regulated. Everything is predictable and controlled. From a practical standpoint, such a place might seem very comfortable. There are no splinters, no mud, no uneven ground. Every surface behaves exactly as expected. Now imagine that after many years living in this artificial environment, that person steps outside for the first time and encounters a tree. They walk up to it and place their hand on the bark. What would their brain experience in that moment? The first thing that would happen is a sudden increase in sensory complexity. Tree bark is not uniform. It contains layers, ridges, cracks, fibers, and tiny irregular shapes formed by years of growth and environmental change. When the person's fingers press against the bark, the receptors in their skin begin firing signals at different intensities and at slightly different times. Some receptors detect pressure from raised ridges. Others respond to tiny vibrations as the skin slides across rough surfaces. Temperature receptors might notice that the bark feels cooler than their skin. Other receptors might detect small shifts in pressure as the fingers move over uneven patterns. To the brain, this is an enormous amount of information arriving all at once. Remember that the brain builds models of the world based on past experience. It predicts what sensory signals should look like and compares incoming data against those predictions. But in this scenario, the person's brain has spent years learning only one kind of tactile environment, smooth, uniform surfaces. Its predictions are based on that limited experience. When the hand touches the tree, the incoming signals will not match those predictions very well. The brain will suddenly encounter patterns of sensation it has rarely or never processed before. This mismatch forces the brain to update its internal model. It has to analyze the unfamiliar signals and gradually construct a new interpretation of what this object is and how it behaves. In neuroscience, this process is sometimes described as prediction error. The brain constantly compares expectations with incoming sensory information. When the two differ, the brain adjusts its understanding of the environment. Touching the bark of the tree would produce a large prediction error for someone raised entirely among artificial surfaces. Their brain would have to work harder to interpret the complex tactile patterns. Interestingly, this process of encountering unfamiliar sensory input can strengthen learning. The brain becomes more active when it needs to revise its predictions about the world. Over time, as the person continues touching natural surfaces, wood, soil, leaves, rocks, the brain would begin building a richer sensory model of the environment. It would learn the difference between rough bark and smooth stone. It would learn how soil compresses under pressure. It would learn how leaves bend and shift when touched. All of these experiences expand the brain's understanding of physical reality. But this thought experiment reveals something deeper about the relationship between humans and their environment. Our brains are not designed to exist in isolation from the physical world. They depend on interaction with complex sensory environments to build accurate models of reality. Every texture you touch becomes part of that learning system. Tree bark, with its layered and irregular structure, provides a particularly rich pattern of tactile information. It contains details formed by years of biological growth, weather, and environmental change. When your fingers move across that surface, your nervous system is reading those details like a kind of physical language. Each ridge and groove becomes a signal. Each change in pressure becomes data. Your brain absorbs that data and adjusts its internal picture of the world accordingly. So even a simple moment, standing beside a tree and resting your hand on its bark, becomes part of a much larger process. Your brain is not just sensing the world, it is continuously learning how the world works, one interaction at a time. There is another assumption people often make when they look at a tree. From a distance, a tree appears quiet and still. It stands in one place, unmoving, sometimes for decades or even centuries. Compared to animals or humans, it seems almost inactive. But that impression is misleading. A tree is not a passive object. It is an incredibly active biological system, filled with countless processes happening every second. Inside the trunk, branches, and roots of a tree, there are billions of living cells. Each of these cells is constantly performing chemical reactions that keep the organism alive. Energy is being used. Molecules are being built and broken apart. Information is being transmitted between different parts of the plant. What looks like a simple piece of wood from the outside is actually a very complex structure. Consider the movement of water. A large tree may transport hundreds of liters of water from its roots to its leaves every single day. This water travels through microscopic tubes inside the trunk called xylem. These tubes form an intricate network that extends from the roots deep in the soil all the way up to the highest leaves. The movement of water through this network is driven by a combination of physical forces. One of the most important is something called transpiration. Leaves constantly release water vapor into the air through tiny openings called stomata. As water evaporates from the leaves, it creates a pulling force that draws more water upward through the tree's vascular system. You can imagine it like a very slow but continuous flow moving through an enormous bundle of microscopic straws. While this is happening, Another system inside the tree moves nutrients and sugars in different directions. This system uses tissues known as phloem. Sugars produced in the leaves during photosynthesis travel through the phloem to other parts of the plant where energy is needed for growth and maintenance. These two transport systems are working all the time. Water moves upward, sugars move outward and downward. Minerals travel from the soil into the roots and then upward into the trunk and branches. All of these movements occur silently and slowly, hidden beneath the bark. Meanwhile, the tree is also constantly monitoring its environment. Specialized cells detect changes in light, temperature, and moisture. When sunlight shifts across the sky, leaves adjust their orientation to capture more energy. When soil becomes dry, the tree modifies how it regulates water loss. If an insect begins feeding on one part of the tree, chemical signals can spread through the plant's tissues, activating defensive responses in other areas. These signals move through the plant in the form of hormones and electrical impulses that travel from cell to cell. Although the process is much slower than nerve signals in animals, the underlying principle is similar. Information moves through the organism to coordinate activity. Even growth itself is an ongoing process. Cells in certain regions of the tree, called meristems, continue dividing and expanding. This is how the tree slowly increases in height and thickness over time. New layers of wood form beneath the bark each year, recording the tree's history in the form of growth rings. Rainfall, temperature, sunlight, and environmental stress all influence how these rings develop. So when you place your hand on the bark of a tree, you are not touching something lifeless. You are touching the outer layer of a structure that contains vast networks of living cells, fluids moving through microscopic channels, chemical signals traveling between tissues, and continuous biological activity. The bark itself acts like a protective shield, guarding the delicate systems inside from insects, weather, and physical damage. Your hand may feel only the rough outer surface, but beneath that surface is an entire living architecture. Water is rising from the soil. Sugars are moving through vascular pathways. Cells are dividing, repairing, and responding to environmental signals. All of this continues whether anyone notices it or not. The tree does not pause its activity when you approach it. It simply continues performing the processes that have allowed plants to survive on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. What appears to be stillness from the outside is actually a slow, steady form of life unfolding beneath the bark. And when your hand rests against that bark, you are briefly in contact with a living system whose internal activity never truly stops. One of the reasons humans struggle to fully understand trees is related to scale. Not just physical size, but time. Our brains evolved to perceive events that occur over seconds, minutes, or perhaps hours. That is the scale at which we operate in our daily lives. We can watch a bird fly, see water flow, or observe an animal move across a field. But the natural world also operates on much longer time scales, ones that are difficult for us to perceive directly. Trees grow on a scale of days, seasons, and even centuries. When a tree sprouts from a seed, it is initially only a tiny structure, barely noticeable. Over weeks, months, and years, it develops leaves, branches, and a trunk that thickens slowly, almost imperceptibly day by day. Compared to the human lifespan, these changes appear gradual to the point of invisibility. Our sensory systems are tuned to detect motion that occurs within seconds or minutes. Slow processes like the growth of a tree can seem static. Yet even what appears still is never truly still. Leaves shift subtly in response to wind, sunlight, and internal processes. The branches sway, sometimes imperceptibly, adjusting their positions over time to capture optimal sunlight. Water moves through the tree's vascular system. Sugars, minerals, and hormones flow within microscopic channels. Cells divide, repair, and respond to environmental signals continuously. From the perspective of an observer attuned to these slow processes, a tree is in constant motion. It is alive in a way that is invisible unless you slow down time or measure processes at the right scale. Roots, the hidden part of the tree, explore the soil with the same constant motion. Microscopic growth at root tips allows the tree to find water and nutrients while simultaneously interacting with fungi and microbes in the soil. These interactions form complex underground networks, sometimes called the wood wide web, where trees exchange chemical signals and resources with other plants. The tree is both a singular organism and part of an interconnected system that operates over long temporal and spatial scales. Humans are not naturally equipped to perceive these slow processes. Our perception filters out anything that does not change rapidly enough to require immediate attention. A tree that grows imperceptibly each day is categorized by the brain as stationary. Our language reflects this as well. We describe a tree as standing still, motionless, or quiet, even though these terms are technically inaccurate at a biological level. This disconnect between our perception and reality makes it difficult for humans to fully appreciate the complexity of a tree's life. Even when we measure these processes scientifically, we rely on instruments to reveal what our senses cannot detect. Time-lapse photography, sensors tracking sap flow, and chemical analyses all allow us to witness the subtle, constant activity of a tree. We begin to see patterns that our brains are not evolved to notice on their own. These tools reveal that growth, movement, and communication occur at scales that are imperceptible without careful observation. The difference in timescales also explains why humans often underestimate the intelligence of plants. We tend to associate cognition and response with speed. An animal reacting in a fraction of a second seems intelligent. A tree responding over hours or days appears inert, even though it is continuously sensing and adjusting to its environment. Our perception biases us toward interpreting activity only when it matches our natural temporal window. When you touch a tree, you are encountering the tip of a system that is operating across multiple scales at once. The bark under your hand is solid, but below it lies a network of cells, fluids, and chemical signals moving slowly, relentlessly, and invisibly. Every leaf, branch, and root is participating in the same processes. Even though your brain perceives stillness, life continues in complex, ongoing patterns. In a way, the tree teaches us about patience and the hidden dimensions of time. It is alive not in the human sense of rapid movement, but in the deeper, slower, and more subtle rhythms of biological systems. When we touch it, we touch not just the surface, but a living process that unfolds over hours, seasons, and centuries, challenging our perception and reminding us that the scale of life is far broader than our senses can naturally grasp. Even after considering the physics, biology, and chemistry of a tree, there remains a deeper mystery, one that science has only begun to explore. Humans instinctively respond to nature in ways that feel meaningful, calming, or engaging, yet we struggle to explain why these responses occur at a cognitive level. This is not about emotions or spirituality. It is about how the brain processes complex sensory environments. The human nervous system evolved in a world dominated by natural patterns, forests, rivers, rocks, soil, and trees. For hundreds of thousands of years, every sense humans possessed was tuned to detect, interpret, and respond to these environments. This long evolutionary history shaped our perception, attention, and even decision-making processes. When a person touches the bark of a tree, their brain receives a flood of sensory information. The surface of the bark provides irregular patterns of pressure, texture, and vibration. Phytoncides and other chemical compounds in the surrounding air add another layer of subtle stimuli. At the same time, microvariations in temperature, moisture, and even static charge interact with the receptors in the skin. The brain integrates all of these inputs to construct a coherent model of the environment. The experience is familiar to the nervous system because it reflects the patterns that shaped its evolution. But there is something even more intriguing. Modern humans spend much of their time in artificial environments. Smooth floors, uniform walls, synthetic materials, and controlled airspaces provide far less sensory complexity than natural environments. The brain evolved to process irregular, multi-dimensional patterns over multiple sensory channels. When deprived of this input, the nervous system may experience what some scientists call sensory impoverishment. The subtle chemical, tactile, and visual patterns provided by a tree, a forest, or other natural environments are precisely the kind of input the brain expects and is optimized to interpret. In other words, natural environments may engage neural circuits in a way artificial environments rarely do. Even when we understand the physical interactions, we still lack a full explanation for why humans feel a sense of presence, attentiveness, or quiet focus around trees. The combination of tactile complexity, chemical signaling, and evolutionary familiarity produces effects that are measurable yet difficult to quantify fully. Heart rate may slow slightly. Stress hormone levels may fluctuate. Immune cells may become more active. Brain activity may shift toward patterns associated with sensory integration and reflection. But why these effects feel profound is still a mystery. Scientists can document the chemical and electrical pathways involved, yet the overall perception of meaningfulness remains poorly understood. This gap highlights a recurring pattern in science. Knowing the mechanisms does not automatically explain the experience. Even when we understand the molecular, neural, and physical interactions in exquisite detail, we may still struggle to articulate why a moment feels significant. Evolution shapes the brain to respond to environmental patterns, yet the richness of perception exceeds our conscious ability to explain it. The brain constructs subjective experiences from objective signals, and the depth of those experiences often outpaces the clarity of our scientific descriptions. Touching a tree illustrates this beautifully. At the microscopic level, forces, charges, chemicals, and neural signals are interacting in complex ways. At the macroscopic level, the tree appears simple, solid, and still. The human mind interprets the experience as familiar, calming, or meaningful. Science can describe the forces and pathways at play, but it cannot fully convey why interacting with a tree feels the way it does. This is the frontier of understanding the space where measurable physical processes meet perception, and where the richness of human experience challenges the limits of scientific explanation. In this intersection lies the real mystery, the gap between what we can measure and what we can experience. It is not a deficiency in science, but a reflection of the astonishing complexity of living systems, perception, and the universe itself. Touching a tree is a simple action, yet it connects biology, physics, chemistry, evolution, and cognition in a way that remains deeply profound and largely unexplained. It reminds us that reality contains layers beyond immediate perception, waiting to be explored and appreciated. Zooming out to the largest possible perspective, the interaction between your hand and a tree becomes even more extraordinary when considered in cosmic terms. Every atom in your body originated long before Earth existed. They were forged inside ancient stars through nuclear fusion, combining hydrogen and helium into heavier elements. When those stars ended their lives in massive explosions, their atoms were scattered across space. Some eventually became part of the dust and gas clouds that coalesced into our planet. The carbon in your skin, the calcium in your bones, the oxygen you breathe, all of it has a history that spans billions of years. The atoms in the tree share the same origin. The carbon in its wood, the hydrogen in its sap, the oxygen in its leaves, all were once part of stars, interstellar clouds, and ancient planets. For billions of years, these atoms moved through the universe, shaped by physical forces, gravity, and chemical reactions, until they eventually became organized into living systems on Earth. When your hand touches a tree, two sets of ancient atoms meet once again, briefly forming an interaction that is physical, chemical, and biological all at once. At this moment, your nervous system is firing electrical impulses, your skin is sensing pressure and texture, and your body is breathing in microscopic molecules from the tree and its surrounding environment. The tree continues its internal processes, water moving through its xylem, sugars flowing through the phloem, cells dividing and repairing tissues, chemical signals traveling between branches. All of these activities happen simultaneously within the same shared physical space. The moment is fleeting, yet it unites billions of years of cosmic history, evolutionary biology, and complex physics in a single point of contact. Even the electrons in your hand and the electrons in the tree repel each other through electromagnetic forces, creating the tactile sensation of touch. Tiny static charges redistribute between your body and the tree, even if imperceptibly. The phytoncides released by the tree interact with your respiratory system, influencing chemical pathways in subtle ways. Your brain receives a flood of sensory input, updating its internal models through neuroplasticity. Every element of the interaction, from subatomic particles to chemical compounds, from neural circuits to evolutionary memory, is governed by the same physical laws that dictate the motion of galaxies and the fusion of stars. In that instant, the tree and your hand are not separate. They are two patterns of matter and energy that share a history stretching back to the formation of the universe. The distinction between you and the tree is only perceptual, a convenience created by consciousness. At the atomic and cosmic level, both are arrangements of the same fundamental particles obeying the same rules. This simple act, touching a tree, is a demonstration of how interconnected all matter truly is. It also challenges the way humans perceive reality. We often think of ourselves as distinct, as individuals separate from the world around us. Science shows that distinction is largely a mental construct. Reality is a continuous system of interactions, and every moment contains countless connections we barely perceive. The atoms in your body and the atoms in the tree are temporary configurations of the same ancient matter, meeting for a brief instant before continuing their journey through the universe. Recognizing this gives a profound shift in perspective. Touching a tree is no longer just a casual action. It becomes an encounter with the universe interacting with itself. Two living systems, billions of atoms each, billions of years in the making, meet for a moment. Forces, molecules, and neural signals converge in a tiny point of contact.